Everybody thought stock markets were all about manipulation, gambling, etc. Most people did not believe that research works. I remember there was Gujarat Ambuja Cement. I told my mom, I want to invest in this. Why was I so sure about buying Gujarat Ambuja Cement when Indira Gandhi came back to power? Arguably, the first piece of decontrol this country ever saw was the decontrol of cement. Can you believe it? That you want to buy a house and you need a permit to buy cement. Not every person can be a successful entrepreneur. As long as you recognize that entrepreneurship is a test of your leadership skills.
What's the best advice that you've received from someone?
Surround yourself with people smarter than you.
How do you gather a thesis of the future potential value of a business?
So we have a methodology called EIBC, Economy, Industry, Business Company. And then you need to build on that thesis with the company itself. And Buffett, for example, says that he doesn't believe in interviews. In order to judge a person, he says, in fact, interviews are misleading. A very important part of being an investor is to have a network. If I can't place a person using my network, then there's either something wrong with my network or there's something wrong with the person.
Dennis, when do you know that this is the right time to exit a business?
In good businesses, you are always exiting at the wrong time.
For the next 10, 20 years, what's the function that will have major impact on how we are going to see the future of India?
What has interfered with our potential is our politics.
Is it possible to start a private equity firm in early 30s if you don't have a track record?
Well, if you have a rich father.
And when you meet companies, the founders, how do you know where are they coming from? Because they have no documented history with them. Of course, you have the numbers of the company, but...
No, that's our work, to figure out their backgrounds. We don't hand over checks in meetings like this. We spend a lot of time figuring out somebody's background. So, it's fascinating that you ask this question. Buffett, for example, says that he doesn't believe in interviews. So, in order to judge a person, he says, in fact, interviews are misleading.
And when you say you do a lot of research, what kind of research do you do?
You do financial research, speaking to people around them, speaking to people that they haven't referred us to, so on and so forth. It's a very exhaustive process. It's a process that we have gotten better and better at over a period of time. A very important part of being an investor is to have a network. Right? So in order to be an effective investor, you need a powerful network. So if I can't place a person using my network, then there's either something wrong with my network or there's something wrong with the person.
And for example, you're an investor. By the function of the time you spent in the market, you have certain kind of powerful network after 20 years. But let's say there is a 20-year-old person and he wants to have a powerful network. How one should go about it? How does powerful network happen?
So two ways. First of all, you have to give it time. It won't happen overnight. It's a process that will yield you a network. How powerful or not depends on a period of time, which is not just about meeting people. It's about meeting people and creating relationships. Right?
And what's the difference between just meeting and then creating a relationship as well?
Think about that. There's completely different, right? You meet so many people. Do you have a relationship with everybody?
No.
So what is the difference between having a relation? How does a relationship happen? How do you build a relationship?
By adding some value.
Correct.
By being of some help.
So whether it is an emotional transaction, whether it is a financial it's about transacting with people you get to know. That's how you build a relationship. People who build great networks are people who are willing to give before they receive. So they meet I met you, I meet you, and then you start receiving from me. Before you start giving, the moment you start receiving, it's more than just a meeting. Otherwise, a meeting is an hour spent together, having a great time. You start receiving from me, then you're getting something tangible.
But I can receive a lot of things from you. But when I'm building relationships, it's because I'm very young. I may not have something that I can...
You're mistaken. Young people have ideas, thoughts. You have to make yourself interesting. So you build a relationship. So when I started actively networking when I got into IIT. So I've been now networking, it's been 35 years. And that's the principle I always followed, that if I have to go into a meeting, it's not just about taking, it's about giving back something. And yes, as a student, you might think you have nothing, but as a person who has, so if you have knowledge, you can always leave ideas. You can always leave something memorable for the person. You can always make yourself useful. So you make memorable conversations by giving ideas that that person has never heard or received, then following up, meeting people again and again with fresh ideas. That's how young people who, according to you, have nothing to give, actually can give so much.
Yes.
And there's always going to be relative youth. Today you're 20 and you might say, I'm young relative to a 40-year person and I have less to give relative to a 40-year person. When you're 50, you have less relative to a 75-year-old person or a 60-year-old person. How do you make yourself interesting and valuable to him? So networking, or having a network, is at the heart of, first of all, it's at the heart of human society. What is society? It's a network. It's at the heart of entrepreneurship, having a network. And it's especially important in the business of private equity investors are congenital networkers. Their ability to invest, their ability to contribute to their investments, to the entrepreneurs they invest in, is a function of many things. And the quality of their network is a very big one. Because you can solve problems for your entrepreneurs. You can connect them to potential customers, to talent, so much.
On the part of making yourself interesting, how do you make yourself interesting? One is by gathering knowledge, by reading books, by getting ideas. What are other ways of making yourself interesting?
That is the best way. That's the way I feel. Of course, there are other axes of interactions. For example, if you meet somebody who shares a hobby with you in singing, you make yourself interesting. Let's suppose you find somebody with whom you have a shared interest in movies, then you make yourself interesting through your knowledge of movies. If you're interested in dancing and you join a dance club, then you make yourself interesting if you have fancy moves. If you're a music club and if you're a guitarist, you make yourself interesting if you have some interesting riffs. So this is what you bring to the table. That's how human beings get interested in each other.
You mentioned that private equity is a function of many things. One of them is having a very strong network. At this age, how do you network with people?
And, you network through people. I meet people all the time. I meet new people through the people I know. Sometimes there are people I want to meet who I don't directly know, so I make a concerted effort to go out and meet them. That's how I network. But some things have changed. For example, I'm no longer very good at networking in events. There was a time I would go to an event and in 3 hours I would have exchanged cards with everybody in the conference. I'm no longer good at that. But I'm better in terms of some other ways of networking. So
what are some other ways?
For example, if I want to reach somebody, if I want to meet somebody, today I'm in a better position to make an effort and reach out to that person, meet that person. I didn't have that capability or ability earlier. So there's some ways, so how your network changes over a period of time. I wish I had the same energy and enthusiasm I had when I was 17 or 18, right? You'd go to an event. There are 300 people in a room. At the end of the day, you have everybody's business card.
And then when you have to, let's say there is some interesting person that you wish to meet, do you directly write him or do you find the closest person in your network and then ask for a reference? What has worked for you?
Both can work. You can, if nothing else works, then you of course cold call, you write a mail. Communications was a different challenge earlier. Very few people had a telephone.
Right.
And there was a secretary between you and the person. So earlier I remember one of when I started out on my journey, one of the big advantages I had is thanks to my dad, we had a telephone at home, right? I mean, when I graduated from IIT India, I had 5 million telephones. That's it. So just the fact that you had a telephone meant you had an advantage, a comparative advantage. Right? Just think about it. A country of 1 billion people, you have 5 million. Right? Fascinating, right? So 1,000 million people and 5 million phones. And then the challenge used to be that, how do you get beyond the secretary?
There is some interesting.
And that was an art, getting beyond the secretary. But you had everybody's, and this is something I did very early on, which is I used to, I guess I learned speaking on the phone from my father, right? But because there was always a telephone at home, I had that advantage, I had that confidence around using a telephone. And I worked on the ability to get beyond the secretary.
What was the ability? What worked exactly?
It's difficult for me to point out, but it's the, it's, you have to choose your lines perfectly.
What do you mean by that?
Which is, why should the secretary hand over the line to the CEO of the organization? I remember in IIT Delhi, I decided to raise money for Tryst, which is, I think, the first Tryst that happened or the second Tryst that happened. Now it's become a very large festival, huge festival. And Rendezvous was very exciting, and we used to raise money for Rendezvous. But raising money for Tryst was a huge challenge because it was a science and technology fair, right? And we were like, who would want to give money for a science and technology fair? And so, nevertheless, I said, okay, I'm going to take a crack at this because the commissions were good. They were, one of my seniors was organizing Tryst, and he said, what, we're really short on money, and we'll give you commissions. And I was always looking for a way to earn money on the campus. So I said, okay, give me a title, print my visiting cards, and I need a telephone line. So he said, he arranged access for me in IIT from one of the head of department's rooms. So I had a telephone line. And I figured out that, listen, a good target for science and technology fair would be targeting PSUs, right? That IIT is working on, and it worked. I cold called something like 25 CEOs of PSUs in Bombay. I think I managed to meet 20 of them. Managed to talk to 20 of them, and I think in those days managed to get 10 or 15 sponsorships.
It's a huge conversion.
And the end of the day, it was a kid from IIT Delhi speaking to the CEOs of NTPCs and so on and so forth. And it was hilarious. In some of these cases, I remember in many of these cases, they thought they were getting a call from IIT Delhi, which was absolutely right. From the convener of Tryst, never figuring out that it's a 19, 20-year-old kid. But I remember one of the very large PSUs, he developed a liking for me on the phone, and he said, I insist, Mr. Jain, that you please come personally to collect the check. Right? We'd love to meet IIT. We love to meet the convener of Tryst from IIT Delhi. And I knew I was in a soup. But nevertheless, they insisted. So I showed up at the CEO's office. And from his reaction, I could see that he was expecting a 50-year-old person. And he was surprised to see a 20-year-old student, 19-year-old student. They're collecting a check from him. But this goes back to how the challenge of communication has changed. Today, people are literally unreachable, right? Nobody reads their emails. Nobody takes calls on people who matter. Don't take calls on their phones, and don't look at all their WhatsApp messages.
Right.
So references have become even more important before. I think cold calling works less than when telephones were a scarcity. But at the heart of any business or activity is the sales challenge, right? The sheer physical nature of the sales challenge, the number of, how do you construct your leads list? How do you reach out to them? How do you convert leads into prospects and prospects into customers? And initially in any enterprise, the entrepreneur is the chief sales officer, right? Is the chief product officer, the chief sales officer. And for many years, in fact, even in 10-year-old, 15-year-old organizations, I mean, the entrepreneur remains as the chief sales officer.
So the first stock that you bought was during your teenage years.
The first stock I bought was in my teenage years, yes.
How did it happen?
Well, my mom was an avid stock picker. She was a housewife, but she was using her savings. She used that rather than buying a house, she bought stocks. And I would support her in her correspondence. In those days, everything was through correspondence. You have to write letters to companies. Companies would send you annual reports. Companies would send you dividend warrants through the mail, and she would apply, she would invest, buy new stocks, etc. And I was close to her, supporting her from an early age in all of this. So, and I used to love reading annual reports. And I used to love reading annual reports, of course, the photographs, all these companies talking about enterprise, business, what things that are happening and stuff like that. And also always try and read the salary of the CEO. My father was a civil servant. And those days, civil servants weren't paid a lot. So, and when you're growing up and you're young, you don't value what you have. You spend so much time thinking about what you don't have. We had so much that, in hindsight, but as a child, you're focused on what you don't have. So growing up with these annual reports, etc., I actually developed an interest in these companies and these businesses, started reading newspapers early. And I remember there was Gujarat Ambuja Cement, and I told my mom, you know what, I want to invest in this. So she gave me 2,000 rupees, about 200 shares.
Which year was this?
It was 1984 or 1988. So it was when I was a teenager, very young. And why was I so sure about buying Gujarat Ambuja Cement? Their campaign, in those days, people used to have very fancy campaigns for IPOs. The campaign was very different. I can, and I've now, now I know the story behind it, etc. But more than that, when Indira Gandhi came back to power, arguably the first piece of decontrol this country ever saw was the decontrol of cement. So until 1983 or 1984, I was 12 or 13 then, if you wanted to buy cement, you needed
license.
You needed a permit. Can you believe it? That you want to buy a house and you need a permit to buy cement. I guess everything was scarce then. And I think one of the first things she did, she came back changed in 1980. She kind of knew that, the system that we had built, the pseudo-Marxist socialist system, wasn't going to work. She was probably prescient, and she started to slowly dismantle a few things. First significant decontrol that I remember was doing away with the need to have a permit to buy cement. And that was a game changer, which meant there would be so much more demand for cement. And then I read about this plant, and they had all this, they had very good collaborations, very good thinking. The language was very different from the way you saw other cement companies. And it felt to me that this would be a good investment. And of course, it doesn't matter, but yes, it did turn out. It was 1,000 bagger. So that was my first investment, and then after that, I started. I guess my mom got the confidence to give me a little more money. This was my mother's money.
You were reading the salaries of ex-CEOs of companies and all that enterprising thing. when you were a kid. When was your first entrepreneurial stint? How did it happen?
Entrepreneurial stint, as in setting up a business.
Yes.
Right? Because IIT, my 4 years in IIT were amazing. Absolutely. They were hugely enterprising. And there was always some new enterprising initiative after another. Constantly. Right? But if you're talking about setting up a business, my first business was in IIT. I set it up in my final year. I started working on it at the end of my third year, which is our industrial training, the 2 months of industrial training. And it was a venture to do equity research. It was to use computers to do equity research.
For companies or for people?
Well, who would be the customer? That would come later. But in those days, there was very little equity research. There was very little belief in equity research. Markets were much smaller. Everybody thought markets were hugely manipulated. This was the time before 1992. Markets were very archaic, and most people did not believe that research works. Everybody thought stock markets were all
Trading,
all about manipulation, gambling, etc. Most people did not believe in either fundamental analysis, technical analysis. But I had read up all those things during IIT. I'd spent 2 years until then reading up about equity research in IIT. Almost in parallel, I was pursuing the MBA and CFA curriculum. And I was so confident that these things work that gave me the reason to set up this venture. I attracted venture funding. I found an angel investor.
How?
Again, through networking, right? Network my way to one of the early tech entrepreneurs who I thought would appreciate this because we were using computers, and who had some global experience of markets, or at least who had some global experience. And in global markets, obviously markets were more efficient, more sophisticated. And who would appreciate that research, analysis, science works in financial markets. It may sound very strange to you. Literally no one believed that there was any place for science in capital markets. Very few people believed. But whoever believed helped me a lot, supported me a lot. Whether it was a professor M.Y. Khan at University of Delhi South Campus, or some of the people who funded me, and people who decided to join the venture.
What happened with the venture?
It failed.
What did you learn?
Customer. Where is the customer for it? It's a tough time finding a customer for our research. Buy-side research is tough to sell even today. And I remained wedded to the idea of research. The way to monetize research arrived a little later, which is through sell-side research. And, where broking houses, for example, provide research. The country reformed in 1991. I think in 92 September, the government allowed, if I remember this correctly, foreign institutional investors to invest in India. SEBI was formed. SEBI had been formed earlier, but the SEBI Act was passed, which gave powers to SEBI to regulate markets. One of the first things that we did as a country is to allow foreign institutional investors to own stocks in the Indian market. Until then, foreign institutional investors were not allowed. And with their entry came a appetite for research, because that's how they operated in their own markets. So suddenly there was demand for research. But initially, my venture suffered because I had no customers. Even when they arrived, there wasn't appetite to pay for it. What that did is that created a cadre of research firms suddenly. So between 92 and 96, 97, India saw the first institutional research houses, brokerage houses built in India. Many of them were foreign brokerages.
Right.
Some of them were homegrown brokerages who were operating like Western firms, right? And they were offering broking, and they were offering sell-side research. But I wasn't enamored with sell-side research. So I decided not to go that way. There was an opportunity almost immediately to take my research skills and create an institutional brokerage. It would have been a highly differentiated venture because, but an offer research for free, that is most sell-side firms do in return for broking income. And they were like I said, there were very few firms that were producing research on Indian stocks then. And that need was filled over a period of time by a number of foreign brokers and a couple of Indian brokers. So going back to my first venture, yes, it failed. When the time between graduating from IIT and setting up Gaja Capital was full of activity and ventures, Gaja Capital was my third innings, right? And the reason we set up Gaja Capital was because prior to Gaja Capital, the firm I had helped set up was another venture capital firm called the View Group. We were focused on dollar revenue, rupee cost. And around 2002, 2003, and there was very little foreign venture capital in India or venture capital in India. Most venture capital in India was focused on dollar revenue, rupee cost.
The arbitrage.
Which is investing in businesses that have rupee costs and are selling to export markets.
Right.
And I grew enamored of the idea of domestic consumption. So I wanted to invest in domestic markets, businesses that were domestic market facing. We used to have this term, the future champions of India's domestic economy. It was an unusual thought. Today it's par for course. Everybody's doing that 20 years later, but that was the reason why I, in a very peaceful, very congenial manner, I discussed leaving the View Group and setting up Gaja.
How did you figure out your initial team? You said, okay, I want to start Gaja. And also tell us behind the name. How did you figure out the name of the firm?
So Gaja stands for India, elephant, and we said, we're not going to name the firm after a Greek goddess. In those days, we were clear that most of our capital would come from abroad. Venture capital is a foreign product. You want to look like a foreign firm. But it was very unusual to choose an Indian name. I mean, everybody wanted to look foreign.
Right.
Right. But we said an Indian firm needs to have an Indian name. Right. The best Indian firm will not be named after a Greek goddess. It should have an Indian name. And then we started thinking, and India is an elephant is Gaja, and that's how it came together. My initial team, or if you talk about, let's say, we are 4 founders, 3 of us are full-time, all of us, in a way, go back sometime. Imran and I worked together at the View Group. Sanjay Patel, who's a strategic advisor, and I worked together at the View Group. And Ranjit and Sanjay go back, many, many years. They go back 30 years. So these were all deep connections on the basis of which we came together. Ranjit initially worked as an operating partner for a year before becoming a full-time partner. And one of the thoughts that was kind of determining how we were putting together the team was that early on we said, listen, operating expertise is important. So we are going to build, at that point of time, operating expertise in the context of venture capital, private equity was, again, relatively unknown. It was seen as a financial business about writing checks. We said this is going to change. Firms have to be built around a combination of investing and operating expertise. So I had a bias towards people with operating backgrounds, and both Ranjit and Imran had operating backgrounds until then. So it was a good yin and yang of my financial and entrepreneurial expertise and their operating expertise.
And how did you convince your first investors? What was the story behind?
my track record contributed, and then the relationship contributed. So it's in our business, it's difficult to, it's always easier to get your second check.
Right.
So at Gaja Capital, most of our capital did not come from people I was meeting for the first time. I'd already been active in the market for 12 or 13 years, made some very successful investments and business. So I had a track record. And then there are people who have not given you capital earlier, but they know of your track.
Right.
So when we set up Gaja Capital, we were not first-time investors. Gaja Capital represented proven expertise. And that's how we got our capital.
You invested in public markets. You had a background of investing in venture capital, and then you also invested in private equity. Tell us, how are these things different? What kind of similarities are there?
So I started making my first private investments in 1995. So what happened is actually public market investing led to private equity investing. There are various kinds of public market investing. My initial style of public market investing was all about spotting inefficiencies. But then I moved to a Buffett style of investing, which is to disregard stocks, but to look at businesses and to think of stocks as a piece of a business. And then, therefore, from owning a lot of stocks, my style changed to owning large stakes in publicly listed companies for long periods of time, right? With the idea that you don't buy a stock to discover inefficiency, price inefficiency. You buy into a stock to ride the underlying trend of the economy, the sector, the business itself. For long periods of time, extraordinary returns are created through compounding, riding a trend for a long period of time. Yes, there might be inefficiency at the point of entry, but you're not simply looking for the collapse of the inefficiency, which is the point where market price is equal to intrinsic value. So there is one style of public market investing which is about discovering differentials between traded price and intrinsic value. And that led me into another style of public market investing, which is about intrinsic value is X today and intrinsic value will be X plus Y tomorrow. It's not about discovering a discount to intrinsic value, but it's about riding the growth of intrinsic value. Right. And that style of public market investing is closer to venture capital and private equity. Because venture capital and private equity is not about discovering the unloved people. It's about appreciating the future potential intrinsic value of what you invest in.
And how do you gather knowledge? How do you gather a thesis of the future potential value of a business, of an industry, or of the country?
You need to build a part of the thesis before you make the company. So we have a methodology called EIBC, Economy, Industry, Business, Company. And then you need to build on that thesis with the company itself. For example, in education, there are multiple trends. And so you could build a thesis around what are the exciting businesses in education or edtech to invest in.
Right.
That there must be a certain, life is often about opportunity meeting preparation, and then it's about perspiration, right? So the preparation must happen before that through top-down. In our case, it happens through top-down research.
Okay.
And where we build out a thesis, EIBC as a thesis, yes, there are times when you meet a business and you don't have a context for it, but it looks super impressive. But then you do have to create the context, because without the context, without the whole thesis, it's very difficult to answer the question that you just again posed to me, which is that how do you get a sense of where this business will be in 5 to 7 years? Where the business will be in 5 to 7 years is not just a function of the business.
Right.
It's a function of how the sector is doing, how the economy is doing, what consumers are thinking, what their consumer behavior is, all of that. So you need to build that thesis.
So what's your thesis about India?
I today have a thesis around India, But actually, one of the greatest gifts my parents gave me is that a faith-based thesis around India. So I won the ovarian lottery. The best thing in a country like India, the best thing that you can do is to choose your parents wisely.
How can you choose your parents wisely?
Of course you can't. What I mean is that almost the biggest determinant of success in India still is who you're born to. Right? We're not a meritocratic society. The next best thing is to choose your zip code wisely. So, and I had such phenomenal gifts. I was born to intelligent, educated parents who were fiercely patriotic. And we were brought up on a diet. In hindsight, so much of it was simple yarn as to how India was the greatest country on the planet. So my decision to stay back in India was not that India would become the greatest country on the planet. What was based on the belief that India is already the greatest country on the planet. Since then, things have changed because you start asking questions, and you discover that it's like advertising, right? It's so something. And you discover that there's a big gap between the product that you sold and what you bought. I discovered that there was a gap between what I had bought and what I actually received, what I paid for and what I actually received. And therefore, then you discover a need to come up with a logic-based thesis. Okay, we're not the greatest country on the planet right now, but can we become the greatest country on the planet, right? Or can we become a great country?
While you're evaluating a business, how do you see the business? What are factors do you have in mind? Why is choosing the right business? Why is choosing the right founder? What type of questions do you ask the founder while you're evaluating that company? What's the most common thing that you do, which is common across all the investments that you have made? What's the framework?
Okay. So, the three most important things for us in a business, in an investment decision, is it must be a good business, it must be a good price, and it must be a good partnership.
What is a good partnership? What is a good business? And what is a good price?
Yeah. These are, a good partnership is which is fair to each other. Good price is where you're paying a reasonable premium to value. And a good business is something which is scalable and impactful and consumes limited amounts of capital to scale and can generate reasonable return on equity. More importantly, a good business is also where in the business there are people who have the ability to execute on that potential and they have a plan to execute. So there are things that go into all of this. Each one of this the responses can be distilled in these telegraphic messages, but really that's the heart of being a professional, which is what constitutes a good business. The answer is not a telegraphic synopsis of 30 words. There are a lot of factors that go into determining what's a good business. Similarly, there's a lot that goes into determining what's a good price. And there's a lot that comes through experience and factual things as to what constitutes a good partnership. So these three parts are at the heart of venture capital or private equity.
Have there been times where all these things were right?
Yeah, but you have magic. Yeah, by that I mean magic is not just about financial returns; it's the amount of joy you get. The choices we make in life are about what makes us happy. Right? So I'm doing what I'm doing because it makes me happy. I love what I'm doing; it makes me happy. And what is the next level of happiness is joy. So joy is magic. Children are born with joy. Little kids, infants have God. They come into this world. They laugh for no reason. It seems to you they're laughing for no reason, but that's because they're born with an opening balance of joy, the joy de vivre that exists when they come into this world. But then over a period of time, we have to discover our joy. It's not you don't So in the context of investing, joy is magic. Magic is joy. And magic is when these three things come together, which is not just about a great financial outcome, but also that you create a great venture, you create a great story, it's creating impact. Even 5 years later, after you've exited it, you still feel proud about it. So yes, these things do happen.
And were there times when all these three things were there, but you didn't like the founder, or you didn't like the company, the person, the people behind the, the price is making sense, the premium is making sense, everything is making sense, but the people don't appeal to you, and you stayed away from the business?
Yeah, I think price comes later. It's very important. In our business, I don't think Buffett says it right. I mean, an A business at a B price is better than a B business at an A price. Right? So you learn through the hard way that making a compromise on what is a good business, it's that compromise is not justified by the price you pay. So just because a good business is available at a very attractive price often doesn't work out. It can work out in public markets if there is momentum, but in private markets, it rarely works out.
Tell us, when do you know this is the right time to exit a business?
Well, in the private equity business, first of all, there's a structure. It's not entirely our choice. We have to work to a certain structure, which is that, we invest our funds which have a certain number of years. So there's a form and a structure. Generally, we try and exit businesses in 5 to 7 years. In good businesses, you're always exiting at the wrong time, in the sense that if you have a good business, you should be owning it forever, right? That's what people say. But that's not what private equity allows you. Private equity, you're working for your investors and you have to give them returns, capture them. So the way we typically think is to invest for 5 to 7 years. And hopefully by the time you have completed your 5 to 7 years,
you have
A, accreted value, and B, you have multiple exit choices. That is the ideal world, right? And there are lots of variations to it. India exiting business has not been easy. It's always a challenge. It's becoming easy. So even if you accreted value, you may not always have all the choices. The real challenge in our business is sometimes when businesses don't work, investments don't work out. You haven't accreted enough value. And how do you exit? Because for a business which is not growing very well, obviously they're not going to be many takers, but you still have to exit them, right? One of the ways we stand out is we are one of the few firms that have exited 100% of our investments once their divers come due. It's hard. It's possibly a unique track record.
How do you do that?
I can't answer that question. Except to say that in order for us to achieve that, you have to make the right choices. You have to think about the exit at the time you make an investment. So one of the strategic thoughts we had is that unlike in the US and India, you cannot assume there is an exit for every business. You have to ask yourself, how will you exit this business at the time you invest? Because it's an exit constrained business.
But don't you think the things will change? Again, you will have to have a conjecture around it.
Yes, but you can't invest on the basis of that. Because had I invested on the basis of that, I would have a portfolio full of unsold businesses. Right? Maybe I will invest on the basis of that. As far as investing is concerned, I'll invest on the basis of that if that situation is already present. Like in many markets around the world, at some price, you can sell any business.
Right.
That's not true in India.
Thanks a lot. We will weave this conversation. I know this was a kind of, random questions thrown at you, but we'll weave this conversation. And very honestly, I learned a lot. There were a lot of things that I need to, double deep on. I need to understand, rewatch, listen. And we believe even if 5 people or learn from this and do something big, our job is done. And thanks a lot for being generous with your time. Super grateful.